Now, it's interesting to note that one of the consequences of the Napoleonic Wars, remember France and Britain going back and forth all the way through, the early 1800s, is that France had occupied Spain during those wars. And as a result of Spain not being able to really pay attention to what's going on with its Latin American colonies, many of these colonies rose up and against Spain. They win their independence. Basically, all that's left as part of this crumbling Spanish Empire is Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Santo Domingo, which is right on the same island as Haiti. And again, Cuba and Puerto Rico aren't going to get, quote, lost by Spain until the end of the 1800s in the Spanish American War. But the Americans look at these new nations, and in many ways, they sort of have some kinship. We overthrew our oppressive ruler 1776 to 1783. They also like the idea of trading with them. And there's rumors that other European countries are going to help Spain get its colonies back now the Napoleonic Wars are over. And the British Foreign Minister Canning goes to the United States and says, hey, wouldn't it be wise if Great Britain and the United States sort of come together to repel all these other European countries? Monroe, the president, says, yeah, I'm good with that as long as you recognize the independence of these countries. And Britain does not want to do that. So America does it alone. Now, it's called the Monroe Doctrine, but it's really written by John Quincy Adams. It's given by Monroe, but it's really JQA's ideas. Now, there's four parts, but it can really be reduced down to two. I'll give all four just to tell you. So basically, they say American continents are off limits to foreign colonizers. So Europe, stay away. They say if any nations attempt to colonize, we're going to really see this as a threat and potentially an act of war. They say the United States won't interfere in any of the colonies that are already here. Again, Cuba, Puerto Rico. And the United States, in turn, will stay out of European affairs. So really what it's saying is, you can't colonize here and we won't interfere over there. Now, what's ironic is the United States had no ability to actually keep other countries from colonizing here. Still, it's really weak overall, and it has no business even trying to interfere in Europe. So it really means nothing at the end of the day. It's non-binding. Many of the other countries sort of laugh at the United States sort of puffing out its chest unnecessarily. And we'll talk more in class about why it even works. But really it has to do with the British sort of helping the United States out almost accidentally. But symbolically it's important because it's a statement of sort of American intentions to prevent European involvement in the Western Hemisphere. And it also shows in some ways this, overconfidence or false confidence or even hubris of this young nation, but it will sort of continue to be a precedent about the United States not wanting anybody to come over and sort of into our backyard. So the Monroe Doctrine is really sort of the only piece that we're going to focus on in terms of any sort of international element. Now we find ourselves in 1824, and 1824 is one of those elections that's important, but it's really sort of more important in hindsight when we look back. It's one of those elections where technically all four candidates are Republicans. There's no Federalist that runs. So you've got two people that came out of the cabinet. So you've got Crawford, who is from the Secretary of Treasury. He's a Southerner. He's a classic sort of states' rights, strict interpretation of the Constitution, like we saw with Jefferson before he did that all with the Louisiana Purchase. You've got Henry Clay, who's the Speaker of the House. He's from Kentucky, which is Southern, but he really sees himself as a nationalist. And again, he's got that BTN, BOTUS, Tariffs, Network of Internal Improvements. You've got John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State. Secretary of States have become president many, many times, so it's really the jumping off point. He's the only non-slave owner. Obviously, he's from Massachusetts. His dad had been president. He supports the economic programs of Clay, more so the bank and the internal improvements than the tariff, although he doesn't like Clay. And then you've got Andrew Jackson, obviously the hero of the War of 1812, the champion of the common man, really sees himself as this rags to riches story, which is true. He really was a rags to riches story, and by the time he's running for president, he's not rags at all. He's quite riches. So in the election, what happens is Jackson wins the most popular votes and wins the most electoral college votes. But again, the Constitution says you have to get a majority of the electoral college votes to win. Now, the top three go to basically not even a runoff. It's actually just going to be the choice of the House of Representatives. But what happens is that Crawford has a stroke, and so he's out of the running by the time they even send it to the House. So it's Adams versus Jackson. Now, it's important to know that Henry Clay, as Speaker of the House, the guy who got fourth place, the guy who obviously wanted to be president and will run a few more times and lose every time. But he looks at these two choices and he's like, man, I don't really like either of these choices. His rival was Jackson. One's from Kentucky, one's from Tennessee. They really sort of saw themselves as equals and then as adversaries. So Clay will never go with Jackson, but he really doesn't like John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is sort of a self-righteous, sort of puritanical guy, and Henry Clay is sort of a hard-living, heavy-drinking, gambling guy. But at the end of the day, they sort of have this kinship over, BTN. So Henry Clay also understands that as a very able and capable politician, he might be in line to get the Secretary of State job, which, as I mentioned before, really is the jumping off point for the presidency. So the deal that's made, and we never will know, we don't know, quote, anyone in the room where it happened, that will say that this was agreed to, that if I throw my support to you, John Quincy Adams, as president, when you become president, you'll appoint me Secretary of State. We don't know that that's the case. What we do know is that John Quincy Adams is a pretty morally upright guy, certainly not known to sort of backroom deals. And we also know that Henry Clay was incredibly qualified to do this. So what happens is Jackson loses when Clay chooses John Quincy Adams. But the minute that happens in 1824 is really sort of the day that we know that Andrew Jackson's going to be elected 4 years later. So you can almost start to be thinking about President Jackson 4 years before he ever becomes president, because his supporters are so upset that he lost, that he was denied this opportunity, when in fact we know that he won the most votes and the most electoral college votes. So John Quincy Adams comes in again. He is the son of a president. He is the only person that sort of appears to be like a Federalist, since his dad, who was the only Federalist. And he calls for an energetic federal government, like Hamilton had called for, like actually Clay had called for. And again, many of the ideas we've seen before. Internal improvements we've seen before. Now, he also is pushing for science at the time, so like a great national university. We had universities, but not a national university. Building and observatories for astronomy, establishing a Department of the Interior to manage federal land. He's a nationalist in a time of sort of emerging sectionalism, and his Republican Party, which again was the only party, really splits in two. The Adams and Clay wing calls themselves the National Republicans, and later on we're going to see that group is going to become known as the Whigs, and the Jacksonian sort of states' writers become the Democrats. So now we have the National Republicans and the Democrats. So Adams serves for 4 years. They're pretty uneventful years. He doesn't do very much, in part because he's sort of a square peg in a round hole at this point. But in the election of 1828, it sort of brings us back to that, initial 1796 and 1800 elections between Adams and Jefferson. Again, this is going to be an Adams, but it's going to be a Jackson. And Jackson really models himself in many ways after Thomas Jefferson. Jackson looks at this tough part. He'd been involved in many duels. Again, the Southerner. And John Quincy Adams, people call him, this sort of angry, ignorant barbarian. He's a gambler. He's owned slaves. He's a killer. He has been involved in many duels. But the biggest, sort of most salacious claim is that he's an adulterer, because the claim is that his wife, Rachel Jackson, was actually married to somebody else while Jackson married her. There was actually just some confusion about when she'd actually gotten divorced, and when it was determined that maybe she hadn't gotten divorced, they quickly solved it. So again, it was one of those technicalities. Now, Adams is labeled by Jackson's people an aristocrat, a monarchist, a professional politician who's never worked a day in his life. Not as bad as the stuff that Jackson was called. And again, Jackson is the people's champion. The farmers like him. The working man likes him. But he can also appeal to the elite Southerners, the plantation owners. He's one of them. He's interesting because he's for a small government. He wants individual liberty. He wants a bigger military. So again, it's sort of odd. He wants a small federal government, but a big military. He's also a nationalist. So he's committed to basically the importance of the Union in the face of sectionalism. So Jackson is quite a contradiction, and we're going to really study that contradiction in the next chapter and try to figure out how can this all be possible at once. But really the key question of his campaign is, shall the government rule or shall the people rule? Now, again, he's sort of the man of the people. In the end, when he becomes president, he will actually be quite a man of the government, not necessarily of the people, but that's neither here nor there, because in 1828, people don't know how he's going to rule. But one of the reasons that he is elected in 1828 is we're seeing property requirements going away. We've seen this really since the end of the Revolution. We've seen this really since Jefferson, but even more and more states are going towards what we know as universal manhood suffrage, where all white men, regardless of owning property, get to vote. And as a result of this, you're going to see many people sort of like Jackson, who sort of come from the people rather than the elite overall, who get elected. We're going to see in the election of 1828 really that sort of center point of the country, or that fulcrum of the country, moving from that northeast to the quote-unquote west, as we sort of see the era of the common man dawning.